The janitor's hands trembled as flashing red and blue lights painted the cold hangar walls. Her mop slipped from her grasp, clattering against the polished floor that she had spent hours cleaning for men who would never remember her name. The pilot's voice sliced through the silence, filled with authority and arrogance as officers surrounded her. She stood frozen, the scent of jet fuel and humiliation thick in the air. But what no one in that hangar knew was that this moment would echo back, when power shifted hands and justice came dressed in the uniform of her greatest accuser's uncle. Before the truth unfolds, make sure you subscribe to my channel, Racism Untold Stories, where real-life-inspired tales like this reveal the unseen faces of power, prejudice, and redemption. The night shift always felt longer inside the airport hangar. It was not only the echo of footsteps or the distant hum of engines that made it heavy, but the silence that reminded her she did not belong to the same world as those who flew the planes. Marjorie Daniels moved slowly along the polished concrete, her mop gliding in practiced rhythm, the bucket wheels squeaking softly against the floor. She had worked at the airport for 11 years, but every night still felt like a quiet battle for dignity. The smell of jet fuel mixed with disinfectant clung to her uniform, the kind of smell that never truly left even after washing. She was a black woman in her late 50s, her back slightly bent from years of labor, but her eyes still held the glimmer of determination. Each night she would arrive before sunset and leave when the first light of dawn touched the tarmac. Few people ever greeted her, fewer still remembered her name. She often found beauty in small things, like the way light from the private jets reflected against the hangar windows, scattering across the floor like fragments of a dream. It reminded her of her late husband, who used to tell her that light always found its way through cracks. He had been a mechanic before his health gave out, and she carried his words like armor. Marjorie cleaned the private jet section, where executives and pilots carried themselves as if the air belonged to them. The hangar gleamed under fluorescent lights, a temple for men in pressed uniforms, and women in designer coats who stepped out of black cars without ever noticing the people who made the space spotless. She was invisible, yet she noticed everything. That night, a particular jet stood out, sleek, white, with the insignia of an elite aviation company on its tail. She had heard whispers among the staff that it belonged to a wealthy businessman with powerful political connections. She had also heard that his nephew had recently joined as one of the youngest pilots in the company, charming, confident, and reckless. His name was Evan Blake. Evan was everything the system loved: young, white, ambitious, and sure of his superiority. He walked through the hangar as though the air parted for him. Other employees nodded, smiled, or looked away when he passed. But Marjorie had seen his kind before. She had seen their arrogance dressed in politeness, their cruelty hidden behind smiles. Still, she kept her head down. The only sound that filled the hangar was the soft swish of her mop and the occasional rumble of aircraft engines. Marjorie believed that silence kept her safe. Until that night. Hours before the incident, she had stopped near the maintenance area to empty her bucket. Her hands were raw from bleach and constant scrubbing. As she rinsed the mop, she thought about her daughter, Carmen, who had just been accepted into a flight school. Marjorie had worked extra shifts to help her pay the fees. She wanted Carmen to soar above everything that had held her back. She wanted her daughter to be seen not for the color of her skin, but for the strength of her spirit. Sometimes Marjorie would pause and look at the jets taking off, whispering small prayers for her daughter's future. She believed that every act of labor, every night of exhaustion, was a step towards something greater. Yet beneath that hope, there was always tension, an unspoken awareness that people like her could be erased with a single accusation. The airport had strict rules about suspicious behavior, and she had heard stories of other workers being questioned, sometimes even removed, for no reason other than the color of their skin. When Evan Blake arrived that night, His boots clicked sharply against the floor. He had just completed a test flight and was in high spirits. He walked with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. He tossed his flight jacket over his shoulder, his expensive watch glinting under the lights. He noticed Marjorie cleaning near his jet and frowned slightly, as though her presence disturbed the perfection of his world. He muttered something under his breath and continued walking, but his gaze lingered on her mop bucket. A moment later, he stopped, squinting. His eyes caught a glint of metal near the maintenance cart. It was a wrench, accidentally left by one of the mechanics. To him, it looked out of place, maybe even dangerous. And in his mind, the person who did not belong here was the janitor. Marjorie was too focused on her work to notice him watching. She moved the bucket aside, unaware that Evan was already forming a story in his head, a story where she was not a worker, but a threat. He left the hangar for a moment, returning with another pilot. They spoke quietly, glancing her way. Marjorie sensed the weight of their stares but continued working. She had learned to ignore looks that reduced her to suspicion. It had happened before, at stores, in hallways, even on buses. It was always the same script. She existed, and they were uncomfortable with it. By the time she finished mopping the floor, the security lights dimmed to their late-night setting. Marjorie packed her cleaning supplies, humming softly to herself. She thought about how Carmen's first day at flight school would be in just 2 weeks. She was proud, even if she never said it out loud. But as she turned toward the exit, she noticed 2 airport security officers entering the hangar. Their flashlights moved like slow spotlights through the space. Her chest tightened. She knew that look. That cautious approach meant for someone already judged. One of the officers called her over. The tone was polite, but she could feel the suspicion underneath. Evan stood several feet away, his arms crossed, watching silently. The officers asked her questions. Too many questions about why she was there, what she had touched, whether she had authorization. Her ID badge hung clearly from her neck, yet they asked to see it again. In that moment, something inside her shifted. She realized that even after 11 years of loyal work, one accusation could erase all of it. She wanted to speak, to explain, but her voice caught in her throat. The humiliation was heavy, thicker than the smell of bleach that clung to her hands. Evan's gaze was cold, detached, as though this was just another minor inconvenience before his next flight. To him, it was nothing. To her, it was everything. The officers eventually left after confirming her credentials, but the damage was done. The pilots whispered. The maintenance crew looked away. The unspoken message hung in the air. She was no longer trusted. That night, as she sat on the edge of her bed, exhaustion pressed on her chest like a weight. She stared at her worn shoes by the door and thought about quitting. But she could not. She had Carmen's dreams to protect. She had her dignity to defend. Outside her small apartment window, the city lights shimmered faintly, distant as stars. Marjorie whispered to herself that tomorrow would be better. She had no idea that tomorrow would bring the call that would change everything. The call from the man who had humiliated her, desperate for her help, after power turned in a way no one saw coming. Morning arrived with the dull weight of routine. The airport was already alive, engines roaring, luggage carts humming, and the scent of fresh jet fuel cutting through the crisp air. Marjorie Daniels walked through the staff gate as she always did, her uniform freshly washed, her head held just high enough to remind herself she belonged here, no matter how others looked at her. But something in the air felt different. The night before still clung to her like a shadow she could not shake. The memory of the flashing lights, the way the officers had studied her as though she were guilty of something unspeakable, replayed in her mind. Every glance from her co-workers felt sharper, filled with quiet judgment. Even those who once greeted her with small smiles now turned away, avoiding her eyes. The story had spread. Whispers moved faster than truth ever could. By noon, she overheard fragments of conversations near the maintenance hall. Someone said the pilot had reported a suspicious person near his jet. Another claimed the janitor had been questioned about possible theft. It did not matter that the security footage cleared her of any wrongdoing. The stain of accusation was already set. Marjorie moved through the day with mechanical precision, her movements deliberate, her silence heavy. She wanted to confront Evan Blake, to ask him why he had done it. But she knew it would be useless. Men like him rarely faced consequences for the harm they caused. They had the privilege of ignorance, the luxury of walking away without a trace of guilt. Meanwhile, Evan barely thought about her. To him, it had been a minor incident, an overreaction, perhaps, but one he quickly justified in his own mind. He told himself he was only doing his duty to protect company property. He told himself he had not meant for the police to treat her so harshly. Yet somewhere deep inside, there was a flicker of unease that he refused to acknowledge. Days passed. Marjorie continued working, quieter now, her eyes fixed on the floor more than ever. Her supervisor, a stern woman named Miss Keller, began assigning her smaller tasks, away from the pilot's lounge and the hangars where executives gathered. It was subtle punishment, unspoken but deliberate. The hierarchy of class and race had spoken louder than any words could. Yet even in her isolation, Marjorie refused to let bitterness consume her. She poured her focus into her work, into every gleaming floor and polished window. Each act of cleaning became a quiet protest, a refusal to disappear. Still, her heart ached each time she thought of Carmen. She wondered what her daughter would feel if she knew how her mother had been treated by the very people who controlled the skies her dreams aimed toward. One evening, as Marjorie finished her shift, she noticed a group of executives gathered near the control tower conference room. Their voices carried urgency. She recognized a few of them: directors, managers, even the regional head of aviation operations. She did not mean to overhear, but a single name caught her attention. The FAA is sending someone new to oversee safety compliance, a top official related to someone in the company. The mention of the Federal Aviation Administration stirred curiosity. Changes at that level were rare, and they often meant upheaval for the entire organization. She thought little of it then, assuming it had nothing to do with her world of mops and rags. But by the following week, the airport seemed to buzz with a different kind of energy. The same pilots who once swaggered through the corridors now straightened their uniforms and checked their posture. Whispers of new leadership, unexpected appointment, and inspections filled the air. Evan Blake, meanwhile, was nervous. He had received a memo that a senior FAA official would be reviewing the company's operations and conducting personal interviews. His uncle, Gregory Blake, had been rumored to be next in line for a major promotion within the FAA, though nothing had been confirmed. Evan assumed it was someone else entirely. When the announcement came, it sent ripples through the entire airport. Gregory Blake had been officially appointed as the new head of the Federal Aviation Administration. His role meant complete authority over airline regulations, pilot certifications, and aviation company compliance across the nation. The news spread like wildfire. Cameras and reporters swarmed the airport for his arrival. Banners were hung, speeches prepared, and the company's executives stood proudly, ready to greet their powerful new ally. Marjorie stood in the background, holding her mop, as the hangar filled with people. She did not realize yet how closely this moment was tied to her own story. She simply watched, curious about the man everyone seemed to revere. When Gregory Blake stepped out of his car, the air changed. He was tall, commanding, with the composed demeanor of a man who had seen both sides of power. His handshake was firm, his voice calm, his presence magnetic. The executives lined up to greet him, smiling too widely, speaking too fast. Evan was there, standing proudly in his pilot's uniform, waiting for the moment he could embrace his uncle and show off his achievements. But before that could happen, Gregory stopped walking. His gaze drifted across the hangar and landed on Marjorie. For a brief moment, his expression softened. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes that made Evan hesitate. Gregory excused himself from the line of executives and walked toward her. The entire room seemed to pause, the sound of camera shutters fading. Marjorie looked around, unsure if he was approaching her by mistake. When he reached her, he extended his hand with quiet respect. Marjorie blinked, her hands trembling slightly before she took it. She did not understand why a man of such power would acknowledge her at all. Evan watched, confusion spreading across his face. He glanced at the other pilots who exchanged bewildered looks. His uncle spoke to Marjorie for a few moments, his tone low but kind, his eyes filled with something that resembled deep gratitude. Then he turned and walked back to the stage, leaving the crowd whispering in stunned silence. Evan felt a strange chill run down his spine. He could not shake the feeling that something was not as it seemed. Over the next few days, the inspections began. Gregory Blake personally reviewed staff files, safety protocols, and work culture practices. Several managers were called in for questioning. Word spread that he was particularly interested in employee treatment, discrimination complaints, and ethical practices. The tension grew thicker each day. Evan started to notice the shift in tone. The same people who had laughed at Marjorie's expense were now nervous, careful with their words. Ms. Keller avoided eye contact entirely. Then, one afternoon, Evan received a message that summoned him to the FAA review meeting. He expected it to be a standard pilot evaluation, but when he entered the conference room and saw his uncle seated at the head of the table with several FAA officials, his confidence faltered. Gregory's expression was unreadable. There was no warmth, no family familiarity, just professionalism and something colder beneath it. Evan sat down, trying to maintain his composure. He did not yet know that his uncle had already heard the story of the janitor, the false accusation, the humiliation, the silence that followed. And he did not yet know that the woman he had targeted had once helped Gregory himself in a moment of weakness years before, when no one else had cared to see him. The ground beneath Evan's privilege began to shift, though he could not yet feel the full weight of it. The truth was on its way, and when it arrived, it would not just expose his prejudice, it would redefine the meaning of respect inside that hangar forever. The conference room felt like a courtroom. The walls were sterile white, the air heavy with tension, and the hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder than usual. Evan Blake sat at the long mahogany table, his hands clasped tightly together. He had been through countless flight evaluations before, but this was different. This was not about his skills or his record. It was about something else, something he could not quite name yet, but he could feel it, pressing down on him like invisible gravity. Across from him, Gregory Blake, his uncle and now the head of the Federal Aviation Administration, flipped through a thick file. He did not look up. His jaw was tight, his movements slow and deliberate. Around him sat 3 FAA officials, silent observers with sharp eyes that missed nothing. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. When Gregory finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced every sound in the room. "Captain Blake," he began, "I have reviewed your record. You are talented, well-trained, and you come from a respected family, but there is something here that troubles me deeply." Evan straightened, unsure how to respond. His uncle placed a page on the table, a report from airport security. The date at the top sent a cold wave through him. It was the night of the incident. Gregory's eyes lifted to meet his nephew's. They were not the eyes of a proud uncle anymore. They were the eyes of a man who had seen a moral failure hiding behind privilege. "Tell me about the janitor," he said simply. Evan froze. His mouth went dry. "The janitor?" he repeated, buying time. "It was nothing serious. She was acting suspiciously near one of the private jets. I thought—" "You thought," Gregory interrupted, his tone sharp. that she did not belong there. Evan swallowed hard. The room seemed smaller now. I was only following protocol. There had been thefts in the past. I did not mean for the situation to escalate. Gregory leaned back, his expression unreadable. You called the police on a woman who had worked there for over a decade. You accused her without evidence, and when she was humiliated in front of her coworkers, you walked away. The words struck like blows. Evan tried to maintain his composure, but guilt began to creep through the cracks in his confidence. He opened his mouth to defend himself again, but Gregory lifted a hand to silence him. Do you know her name? Gregory asked quietly. Evan hesitated. The question hung between them. He searched his memory, but all he could recall was her face. Tired, humble, forgettable, or so he had thought. No, he admitted softly. Gregory's expression hardened. Her name is Marjorie Daniels, he said. She has been working at that airport since before you were out of flight school. She cleans your hangar. She maintains the space you take for granted. She is invisible to you, but not to me. Evan looked up, startled. What do you mean? Gregory stood slowly, his voice deepening. Years ago, before I became who I am now, I was a young air traffic controller at a small regional airport. I was exhausted, overworked, and I made an error that could have cost lives. When the stress nearly broke me, I left the tower one night and sat on the steps outside, thinking about quitting. A janitor approached me, a woman with tired eyes and hands that looked like they had carried the weight of the world. She brought me coffee. She told me that failure was not the end if I remembered why I started. The room fell silent. Evan's heart pounded in his chest. Gregory's eyes darkened as he continued. That woman's name was Marjorie Daniels. She saved me from walking away from this career. And years later, when I saw her name in this report, listed as a suspect, because my nephew decided she looked out of place, I felt something I have not felt in a long time. Shame. Evan's throat tightened. The officials shifted uncomfortably. The weight of the revelation filled the room like thunder before a storm. Gregory walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the runway below. Do you understand what it means to carry power, Evan? He asked without turning around. It is not about your uniform, your rank, or your bloodline. It is about responsibility. You were given privilege, and you used it to humiliate someone who had earned her place through sweat and sacrifice. Evan wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but every word died before it could form. He realized in that moment how blind he had been, how his arrogance had turned into cruelty without his even noticing. Gregory turned back, his face a mask of disappointment and quiet fury. I am not here as your uncle today. I am here as the head of the FAA, and I cannot overlook what you did. You will be placed under disciplinary review for misconduct, and you will attend an ethics retraining program focusing on discrimination and workplace respect. Until then, you are grounded. The words hit harder than any punishment Evan had ever known. Grounded. The very thing he loved most, flight, was being taken from him because of his own actions. He felt a hollow ache in his chest as realization dawned. Gregory's gaze softened slightly but did not waver. I will not destroy your career, Evan, but I will not allow you to continue without understanding the damage you caused. You will spend the next month assisting ground crew and janitorial staff at the same airport. You will work beside the people you once dismissed. You will clean the floors you used to walk over, and maybe then you will learn what it means to earn respect instead of demanding it. Evan lowered his head. Shame burned through him like fire. Gregory closed the file and stepped toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and looked back. There is one more thing you should know. Marjorie never filed a complaint against you. When I spoke to her, she said she did not want to see you punished. She said she just hoped you would learn. That final truth struck deeper than any reprimand could. The woman he had wronged the most had shown him more grace than he deserved. When the meeting ended, Evan walked out of the conference room in silence. The corridors that once made him feel powerful now felt endless. Every polished floor reminded him of her. Every reflection showed him what he had been: blind, entitled, and small. Outside, the sky was bright with sunlight. He stood near the hangar and watched a plane take off, the roar of its engines echoing through the air. For the first time, he did not see freedom in that ascent. He saw the weight of humility, and somewhere across the tarmac, Marjorie Daniels was finishing her shift, her hands steady, her gaze calm. She did not know that the man who had humiliated her was watching her now, his heart heavy with the beginning of understanding. That night, Evan stayed long after his shift ended, helping a mechanic sweep the hangar floor. The mop felt foreign in his hands, but for the first time, he understood what it meant to serve rather than to command. The real flight, he realized, was not about soaring above others. It was about learning how to stand beside them. The days that followed unfolded with the quiet rhythm of reflection and humility. The airport, once a stage for arrogance and unspoken hierarchies, became a mirror through which Evan Blake began to see the world he had ignored. His uncle's order was not simply a punishment, it was an education written in silence, labor, and humility. Each morning he arrived before dawn, dressed not in his crisp pilot uniform but in the simple gray overalls worn by the janitorial staff. The first day, whispers followed him through the corridors. Some laughed behind his back, others watched in disbelief. The golden boy of the skies now pushed a mop, carried cleaning supplies, and emptied trash bins beside those he had once overlooked. At first, his movements were awkward. The mop slipped from his grip. The smell of disinfectant stung his nose, and his back ached from bending over the tiled floors. The work demanded patience and endurance, things he had taken for granted. Yet, as the hours turned into days, something inside him began to shift. He started to notice the quiet dignity of the people who did this work every single night. He saw how they moved without complaint, how they smiled at one another in passing, how their hands bore the stories of endurance that wealth could never purchase. He began to listen to the rhythm of the world he had once been too privileged to hear, the sound of brooms sweeping, carts rolling, and laughter echoing faintly through the hangar at midnight. And then there was Marjorie Daniels. The first time he saw her again after the disciplinary meeting, she was cleaning near the large windows overlooking the runway. The light from the rising sun washed over her, turning her silhouette into something almost sacred. He hesitated before approaching her, his steps uncertain, his throat tight with guilt. She turned slightly, noticing him from the corner of her eye. Her expression was calm but unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them held the weight of everything that had happened, the humiliation, the injustice, the unspoken forgiveness. Evan lowered his head in acknowledgement. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but no words felt worthy. So instead, he picked up a mop and began to work beside her. They moved in silence, the swish of the mop the only sound between them. It was not forgiveness in words, but in action. It was not immediate redemption, but the first fragile step toward it. Days turned into weeks. Evan's hands grew rough, his body sore. Yet for the first time in his life, he felt something resembling peace. He began to understand that humility was not weakness, it was clarity. He had lived his life at 30,000 feet, detached from the earth, from struggle, from humanity. But now, grounded and stripped of privilege, he felt the truth of what his uncle had tried to teach him. Marjorie watched quietly. She did not gloat or hold his past against him. She worked as she always had, steady, patient, and dignified. When others mocked him, she said nothing. When someone tried to provoke her to speak ill of him, she only said, "Everyone learns at a different time." There was grace in her simplicity, and it humbled him more than any punishment could. One evening, as the shift ended, the airport lights dimmed and the last plane of the night lifted into the sky. Marjorie sat on a bench near the hangar doors, her thermos of tea beside her. Evan approached slowly, unsure whether to sit or walk away. She looked up and nodded toward the empty space beside her. He sat down, staring at the runway lights that glowed like distant stars. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was calm, almost peaceful. Finally, Marjorie spoke. Her voice was soft but carried strength. "You love the sky, do you not?" Evan nodded. "Yes," he said quietly, "but I did not understand what it meant to deserve it." Marjorie smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "The sky does not belong to anyone," she said. "It only opens for those who respect the ground beneath it." Her words lingered in the air, simple yet profound. He realized that she was not only speaking of flight, but of life, of equality, of the unseen labor that held everything together. The next week, Gregory Blake returned to the airport for an official inspection. When he entered the hangar, he found his nephew mopping the floor side by side with Marjorie. He said nothing for a long time, simply observing. There was something different in Evan's posture now, something quieter, more grounded. After the shift ended, Gregory approached them both. "Ms. Daniels," he said respectfully, "I wanted to thank you once again for your kindness. You have taught this place more than any regulation ever could." Marjorie gave a small smile. "I only did what was right," she said. Gregory turned to Evan. "Your evaluation period is complete," he said. "You may return to flight duty. But I hope you understand that returning to the sky should never mean leaving the ground behind." Evan nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "I understand," he said. "Truly I do." As weeks passed, word of the transformation spread quietly among the staff. The once arrogant pilot who had called the police on a janitor now greeted every employee with respect. He helped mechanics carry tools, shared meals with ground crew, and ensured that every voice in the hangar was heard. The change was real, visible, and lasting. Marjorie continued her work, steady as ever. But something about the atmosphere around her had changed. People saw her differently now, not as invisible, but as the heart of the place. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity, yet her presence commanded a new kind of respect. Months later, at a staff appreciation ceremony, Gregory Blake invited Marjorie to stand beside him as he addressed the employees. Cameras flashed, executives clapped politely, but for once it was not the men in suits who stood in the spotlight. It was the woman whose hands had scrubbed the floors for over a decade, the woman whose grace had turned humiliation into transformation. Gregory spoke with reverence. There are moments in life when leadership is not about rank or title, but about humanity. Tonight we honor someone who reminds us that the true foundation of this industry, of any industry, is the integrity of those who serve quietly, with dignity. He gestured toward her. "Ms. Marjorie Daniels, thank you for reminding us all what it means to lead without authority and to forgive without bitterness." The room erupted in applause. For the first time, Marjorie stood in the same space where she had once been humiliated, but now she stood as a symbol of grace, strength, and resilience. Evan watched from the crowd, his chest tight with emotion. When their eyes met, she nodded gently, a small gesture of acknowledgement that said more than words ever could. Later that night, as she walked through the empty hangar, the air smelled of jet fuel and rain. She looked up at the sky, vast and endless, and whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for revenge or recognition, but for justice done quietly, through hearts that had learned to change. She picked up her mop and began her work once more, each motion steady and sure. Across the runway, a plane took off, its lights piercing the darkness. Somewhere inside that plane, Evan Blake looked down, his reflection mirrored against the clouds. For the first time, he saw not distance, but connection, between earth and sky, between privilege and humility, between two souls who had changed each other forever. And though no one else would ever know the full story, the lesson would live on in every corner of that airport. Respect must rise as high as the planes we fly. If this story moved you, help keep these powerful messages alive. Subscribe to Racism Untold Stories, where every story uncovers truth, challenges prejudice, and reminds us that dignity knows no uniform.